There is a manuscript in the Bodleian Library at Oxford that most visitors never ask to see. It is a 13th century Latin translation of Ptolemy's Almagest, the foundational text of Western astronomy for over 1,000 years. The Latin is clean, authoritative, and it carries a colophon attributing the translation to Gerard of Cremona, working in Toledo around 1175. What the colophon does not say, what no annotation in the Bodleian's catalogue makes plain, is that Gerard was not translating from Greek. He was translating from Arabic. He had moved to Toledo specifically because he knew the Almagest did not exist in Greek or Latin anywhere in Western Europe. The only surviving copies were Arabic, produced by scholars in Baghdad 3 centuries earlier. Gerard learned Arabic for this single purpose, and the institution that had created that Arabic copy, that had preserved Ptolemy when Europe could not, was dismantled 80 years after Gerard's death. Its contents were thrown into a river. I went looking for what else was in that river. I found it because I was looking for something else entirely. I was trying to trace a single lost treatise by Galen, a text on the composition of medicines referenced in later Arabic pharmacological works, but absent from every Greek manuscript tradition I could locate. The trail led backwards through Toledo, through Damascus, and ended in a city that no longer exists in the form it once held. That city was Baghdad, and to understand why Baghdad matters to the history of everything that came after it, I had to go back to the 8th century. In 762, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur founded Baghdad on the western bank of the Tigris. He called it Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, and he designed it as a perfect circle, a geometry that was not accidental. Within 2 generations, it had become the largest city on earth. By the 9th century, its population had reached approximately 1 million people at a time when London held perhaps 30,000. The scale alone is difficult to absorb, but the scale is not what matters most. What matters is what the city chose to do with its wealth. Under the Caliph al-Ma'mun, who reigned from 813 to 833, a palace library that had existed since the city's founding was expanded into something unprecedented. Western sources call it the House of Wisdom, a translation of Beit al-Hikmah, though the name understates the institution's scope. It was not a library in the modern sense. It was a state-sponsored translation bureau, a research centre, and a deliberate program of intellectual recovery on a scale that had no parallel in the medieval world. The method was systematic. Teams of translators, many of them Nestorian Christians fluent in Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, worked to render the entire surviving corpus of Greek scientific and philosophical writing into Arabic. The early translations moved from Greek to Syriac to Arabic. Later, as the translators' skills sharpened, they worked directly from Greek to Arabic. The most prolific of these translators was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian physician who ran a school of translation in Baghdad from roughly 830 to 873. Hunayn and his associates translated virtually all major Greek medical and scientific texts within 50 years. I want to be careful about that claim, because virtually all is the kind of phrase that invites skepticism, but the documentation supports it. Hunayn's own account, the Risala, catalogues over 100 works of Galen alone that passed through his school. He describes sending agents across the Mediterranean to find manuscripts, travelling himself to Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Several of the texts he translated, including works by Galen and Archimedes, survive today only in their Arabic versions. The Greek originals are gone. Without Hunayn, they would be gone entirely. The translation movement was not limited to preservation. It generated original work of extraordinary importance. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the early 9th century, wrote a treatise on solving equations that gave the world the word algebra, from the Arabic al-jabr. His name, Latinized, gave us the word algorithm. These are not marginal contributions to the European intellectual tradition, they are the foundations of it. And by the 13th century, Baghdad held 36 public libraries, a network of bookshops in a dedicated market quarter called the Souk al-Warakin, and a manuscript culture so dense that copying texts was a recognized profession with its own guild structure. For 2 centuries, this enterprise ran without interruption, and then, in the winter of 1258, it stopped. Here is where the institutional record becomes difficult to read as anything other than a pattern. In January 1258, a Mongol army under the command of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived at the walls of Baghdad. The force numbered between 150,000 and 300,000, depending on the source. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, had refused to submit. The walls were breached on the 5th of February. What followed was a week of systematic destruction that contemporary historians describe with a consistency that leaves very little room for exaggeration. What happens to a civilization's memory when every copy of its foundational texts is held in one river valley? The record does not support the version of this story that most of us were taught. I have been trying to piece together the sequence of what was destroyed, and the primary sources are remarkably specific. The historian Rashid al-Din, writing within a generation of the siege, records that the Mongols threw the contents of Baghdad's libraries into the Tigris. Multiple sources, writing independently, attest that the river ran black with ink. This is not metaphor. Parchment and paper dissolve at different rates, but the iron gall ink used in Arabic manuscripts disperses quickly in moving water. The image of a river turned dark with dissolved text is physically plausible and multiplier tested. I checked 3 independent contemporary accounts. The detail appears in all of them. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed, wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses, a method chosen because Mongol custom forbade the spilling of royal blood on open ground. The 36 libraries were razed. The Souk al-Warakin, that entire quarter of booksellers and copyists whose livelihoods depended on the reproduction and sale of manuscripts, was destroyed. The death toll is contested, but even the most conservative modern estimates place it above 200,000. I keep returning to a figure I cannot name because his name does not survive. He is a composite drawn from what the sources tell us about the artisanal class of Baghdad's book trade. He is a copyist, a man who has spent 30 years in the Souk al-Warakin reproducing medical and astronomical texts by hand. In the months before the siege, he is working on a copy of a Galenic treatise, a text on the properties of simple medicines that is referenced in the Fihrist, the extraordinary 10th century catalogue compiled by Ibn al-Nadim, but that does not survive in any known manuscript today. He works slowly. The text is damaged in places, and he is comparing it against a second partial copy to reconstruct the missing passages. He does not know that this is the last copy of this text in existence. He knows only that the work is painstaking, that the ink must be mixed fresh each morning, and that the demand for medical texts in the book market has been steady for as long as he can remember. I want to hold that image for a moment because it speaks to something the institutional history alone cannot convey. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, 3 centuries earlier, had written in his Risala about travelling to Damascus and finding half a treatise he had been seeking for years. The manuscript was damaged, disordered, incomplete. He carried it back to Baghdad and spent months collating it with fragments found elsewhere. I am paraphrasing because the original account is in Arabic and the translations of this period are contested in places, but the substance is clear. Knowledge in the medieval Islamic world was not abstract. It was physical. It existed in specific copies held by specific people in specific rooms, and when those copies were destroyed, the knowledge did not float upward into some eternal archive. It vanished. The Fihrist, compiled by Ibn al-Nadim in 987, catalogues thousands of titles across every field of learning. I have spent time with the Fihrist, cross-referencing its entries against surviving manuscripts. Many of the titles it lists have never been recovered, not lost in the sense of misplaced, not awaiting rediscovery in some forgotten storeroom, but gone. The physical objects that carried those texts were destroyed, and no copies existed elsewhere. How do you mourn a text that no longer exists in any language, in any archive, anywhere on earth? What compounds the destruction is what came after it. When Gerard of Cremona and his successors translated Arabic scientific texts into Latin during the 12th and 13th centuries, they performed an extraordinary service to European learning. But the names changed. Al-Haytham became Al-Hazan. Ibn Sina became Avicenna. Ibn Rushd became Averroes. The Latinization was not innocent. Over centuries, these figures were absorbed into a narrative of European intellectual progress in which they appeared as minor tributaries feeding a Greek to Roman to Renaissance mainstream. The Arabic language tradition in which they had actually worked, the tradition that had preserved and advanced Greek learning while Europe had no institutional capacity to do so, receded into a footnote. I checked this against modern educational outcomes because I wanted to know whether the erasure was merely historical or whether it was ongoing. A 2019 British Council survey found that fewer than 2% of British students could name a single scientist from the Islamic world. Not a single one. 5 centuries of systematic, state-funded scientific work, and it has been reduced to a statistical zero in the culture that benefited from it most directly. Not everything was lost in the Tigris. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, a polymath and astronomer, survived the siege by entering Hulagu's service. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because al-Tusi's position was morally complex. He advised the man who had ordered the destruction. But he also persuaded Hulagu to fund the construction of the Maragay Observatory in what is now northwestern Iran, and he used his position to rescue manuscripts from Baghdad's ruins. Some of the astronomical models developed at Maragay appear almost unchanged in the work of Copernicus 2 centuries later. The line of transmission is still debated among historians of science, but the structural similarities are documented and striking. Go back to the Ashuk al-Warakin. Go back to the man at the copying desk. It is February 1258, and the Mongols are inside the city. The copyist has not finished the treatise on optics he has been working from, a text referenced in the Fihrist that does not survive today in any known manuscript. He wraps the unfinished pages in oilskin, because that is what you do with a manuscript you intend to protect, and he carries it toward the river, hoping to cross to the eastern bank where the destruction has not yet reached. He does not cross. The manuscript is taken from him at the riverbank. It is added to the mass of volumes being carried from the libraries and the bookshops and the private collections and thrown into the water. He stands at the edge of the Tigris and watches the ink begin to bleed from the pages. The letters separate from the parchment slowly at first, then faster as the water saturates the binding. The text becomes illegible within minutes. The words lift from the surface of the page and disperse into the current, carried downstream past the city walls, dissolving until there is nothing left but a faint darkening of the water that could be mistaken for shadow. The river does not know what it is carrying. The current does not distinguish between a tax record and the only surviving copy of a treatise that took 3 centuries to assemble. The question I keep returning to is not who destroyed it. It is who decided it did not matter enough to remember. The Mongols did not throw those manuscripts into the Tigris because they hated knowledge. They threw them because knowledge weighed nothing in the calculus of conquest. A library is heavy to carry and worthless to an army that measures wealth in pasture land and tribute. The destruction was not ideological, it was indifferent, and the European erasure that followed was not a conspiracy. It was something quieter and more durable than a conspiracy. It was the natural tendency of civilizations to forget debts they would rather not acknowledge. What do we call a loss that no one remembers to grieve? 5 centuries of scholarship entered a river in 1258 and have not yet returned to the curriculum. The debt remains. The silence around it is not neutral, and somewhere in the current of the Tigris, the ink is still dissolving.